Christmas, my mom had like a bunch of cheese, and we were all still eating, and he was kind of playing around. And then somebody went in there and he had taken each of like the nice cheeses and thrown it in the sink. Well, he's telling you. Like at least you have straw. Right.
All right.
Yeah, if anyone comes in late, you put one in.
All right, y'all, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Did anyone need the QR code for the presentation before we start? So you can follow along? Okay, cool. So, welcome to my IEP. Let me record, sorry, I forgot. Just kidding, I've already been recording for 3 minutes. All right. Welcome to the IEP Information Session. This is gonna be super low key. If you have any questions or if you want me to repeat anything, just go ahead. I mean, you can raise your hand, but also just kind of pipe up, I don't know. I teach high school students and middle school students, so I might be like, raise your hand if you have a question, but we're adults, so if you have a question, just kind of speak out. I'm also a little bit nervous today. Ooh. So my session today is basically empowering autism parents to advocate effectively. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown on what the actual IEP process looks like, and then some common issues that you might have, some common problems you might run into, and how to tackle them. So before I start, welcome. Who am I? My name's Megan. I've met most of you guys, but this is our first time. Thank you for driving out here to see little old me and shop. I know that's the real reason you're here. So I have a master's in education. I'm SPED certified in the state of Texas. I've been working in advocacy and education for 10 plus years. I'm also an autism mom. My daughter Stella is non-speaking autistic. She's 6 years old. Her special interest is car washes, and she's precious. I'm an educational advocate, and I'm the founder of Love Over Labels Advocacy. If anyone would like business cards, they will be available at the end of the presentation.
Megan, can you show them your tattoo that you did for Stella?
Yeah. So Stella's non-speaking, so she uses an AAC device. So this is my most recent tattoo. I designed it myself, and honestly, it sucks kind of that tattoos are forever, because I probably should have gone with a QWERTY keyboard instead of a ABC, because her iPad is QWERTY, but it is what it is. She still loves it, so mostly she uses it for when she's saying yes or no, because I did put some of her core buttons up here, so yes, no, more, all done, I needed help. And so usually I'll be like, it's bedtime, she goes, no. yes. So yeah, that's our most recent addition to our house. She loves it. But yeah, so for today's purpose and why this session matters, overview. The session is kind of designed to demystify the IEP process. Even if your child has an IEP, it can still feel really overwhelming a lot of the time. So I really want to break it down into manageable chunks for us. And I want you to be empowered to confidently advocate for your child. And so my goal today is to provide practical tools and answer your questions.
I already have a question, yeah. Okay, so, and my kids are not the age yet. I have my 3-year-old, so we're barely getting to like school age, but like, is it called an ARD in Texas, or is it called an IEP?
So the actual document itself is an IEP, an Individualized Education Plan,
Okay.
but the meeting in Texas, for some reason, is referred to as an ARD, which is an annual review. What is it? Dismissal, there we go, yeah.
Okay.
So everywhere else in the United States, predominantly, you will hear it referred to as an IEP meeting, but
Okay.
in Texas, it's referred to as an ARD meeting.
Okay.
All right, so our agenda, we're gonna go over general IEP information, and actually to that point, you might hear me talk about ARD and IEP meeting interchangeably, but if it has the term meeting, I'm talking about in Texas, the ARD meeting. We'll also go over some tangible takeaways for success. We'll do a Q&A session if anything didn't get answered, and then if any of y'all did bring your IEPs and you have questions or you wanted to go over anything, I can go ahead and look at it for y'all. So what is an IEP? Kind of already went over that, but an IEP is the foundation of special education. So an Individualized Education Plan is a legally binding document. That means that it is basically a contract between the school and you and your family and your child for what they are legally obligated to provide for your child. And it outlines your child's unique needs and the services they will receive. So it should be specific to your child and their needs. An IEP is not guaranteed on the sole basis of a diagnosis. So a lot of people think that if your child has a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis, that means you're guaranteed to get an IEP. That is not true. So you have to also have an educational diagnosis, which the school performs. That's what they determine the IEP on. So if you already have a medical diagnosis, it does help just in legitimizing the need, but it is not a guarantee for an IEP. All right. Like I said, I get hot when I speak. Trust the process. So there's multiple steps in the IEP process. The first one is a referral, and that's a written request for evaluation. This can actually come from anyone in the school setting, including yourself as a parent. So if your child does not have services and you believe that they need them, you can request for the IEP services to begin, for that process to start. The school must respond in the state of Texas in 15 days. So once you actually send that email or whatever it looks like, always do it in writing, they have 15 days to respond back to you and to get that process started. Once the referral process has began, then those 15 days are over, or once they've started it, you'll jump into the evaluation phase. In Texas, that must be completed within 45 school days. So if that goes through spring break, those days don't count. So sometimes, like, I always recommend trying to do it at the beginning of the school year or at the beginning of the calendar year, so you don't have those big gaps of like spring break, summer break, because they don't count towards that 45 days. So must be completed within 45 school days after consent is given to begin the process. Then you have eligibility. So that's what we were just talking about. Just because you have a medical diagnosis does not mean that you or that your child is eligible for an IEP. And so the team will determine if your child qualifies under one of 13 disability categories. And so once they've determined that they're eligible, then you'll move into the annual review. So once they actually determine your child's eligible, they'll go through, they'll write the IEP process, and then from there on, it's pretty protocol. So every year you'll have an IEP that's reviewed, and you'll have that annual ARD meeting. And then every 3 years, you go through what is known as a tri-annual, which is a reevaluation. So your child is then reevaluated to see if they still qualify for IEP services every 3 years. Whew, a lot. Any questions just from that little section?
I have a question on timing. So
Yeah.
we went through the IEP process when we tried early childhood special education, but now we've been in ABA, and I'm looking at getting him back into school next year, potentially. But I want the IEP that, is out of date, basically. I want the new one set up before he goes. Like, I don't want him set up, or like going to school with nothing on record. So will they let me, like, if I start now, we can get that in place?
Yes.
And get it, okay.
And so that's what a lot of people will say, like, oh, my child doesn't have an IEP because they're 3 or because they're doing ABA. I always recommend having an IEP on file with the school district. My daughter's had an IEP on file with CFISD for 3 years now, but she's only went to their school for like 4 weeks before I was like, it's not feeling it. So she's been doing ABA therapy, but you can still have annual ARD meetings. You can still keep that IEP active.
Okay.
So even if your child is not attending school, I still recommend getting that IEP on record. Just so if you ever do make that. If you ever do make that's Texas now. Somebody's big old truck. But it does also help too, because sometimes we know, like, if your child's in ABA, there's a lot of turnover there. So you could love your ABA center, and then within like 2 months, you're like, who are these people? You always want to kind of have that IEP on file, because then if you do transition back into the school, you can do it instantly, and the IEP is already active.
That's good to know. I wish I had done that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. They think it's either or, but you can always have that IEP on file.
So I'm in the you go first.
No,
you
you
had
do
your
it.
hand up, right?
Because you might.
Okay, so I'm in the process of that because my son is 5. He's in ABA, but I'm getting ready to this fall. I want to pull him out of ABA. I think it's that time, and I'm very nervous, right? But my question is, should I contact the school because he's never had what's it called? This is new to me.
An IEP meeting,
yeah, he's
or
never
the
had that on
evaluation?
file. Like, we got him diagnosed. He's been in ABA since.
Yeah.
But I left voicemails to the school district that my son would go to, and they haven't called me back. So is it better to go in person?
So I always recommend putting it in writing, because then there's no question. Since they legally have 15 days to respond, let's just say your voicemail accidentally got deleted or there's no evidence of it. So you can go in person as well, but what they're going to tell you to do is email them. So I always recommend email the principal. Yeah, and then you can actually look at the school's, the school district's diagnostician, or they sometimes have them slotted for the specific schools. I CC everybody on those emails, principals, APs, I want everyone to know that I'm there. And then once you have literally like hit send on that email, they legally only have 15 days to get back to you about it. 15 school days. So yeah. And because the process can take long, especially with breaks and things like that, I would just get it going as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's what I heard from other moms, and they told me to do it like this time, and they have enough time.
Yeah, and the beginning of the school year is when they're doing all of their ARDs, so they're probably gonna push you to the end of the line for that, and they're gonna wait as long as possible, not like out of meanness, but just because they have to get all of their annual reviews done. So I always recommend just starting that process as early as possible.
Okay.
And then I think you had a question, right?
Yeah, so my daughter will be 4 in March. She's in a school, Spectrum of Hope in Cypress.
Oh yeah.
ABA, we came from League City and it was amazing. I mean, she went from no eye contact to the point where my mom's neighbor is in the special needs department in the public school. She says, don't put her in there. Like, that's how much progress she's made. Could she do an IEP and still be in regular classes when she starts kindergarten?
So like, would she be placed in Gen Ed but with an IEP?
Is Gen Ed like
General education? Yes. So yeah, that's part of the IEP process is they evaluate where your child should receive services. So legally, they're required to put your child in the least restrictive environment. So if it's deemed possible that she can be in, sorry, I didn't catch that. That she can be in a general education classroom, that's where they'll put her, but she'll still have an IEP with accommodations.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, like just to for an example, my youngest Tyson, he's in 3rd grade now, but when he started school, my oldest has always been in life skills, but Tyson was higher, smarter type situation. So when he went to school, he started in Gen Ed, even though he was still non-speaking, and it was like a really hard time for him. We knew it would be, but he, so then they started the process of evaluating him. So then it's good, it feels hard, but like they take their time to like see where they need to be. So then they placed him in this RISE program, which is like reaching individual student expectations. So it's supposed to be more because his behavior, he was, so he's in there, but now we're in the process of trying to get him moved because the demand is too high for him with his PDA profile. So it's just not every day he has aggression, and like at home we've seen progress, but there we haven't. So like they will kind of start him off there, but if you have all that in place, they'll make sure to, they have people like the first day they were there observing him, like, cause we got like, oh, your son eloped 1,417 times today. Like they got a clicker, they're like ready to,
A clicker.
So it's like they'll click, yeah, exactly. Like that's what he was, that's why he got kicked out of daycare when he went, because we don't have the staff to accommodate his elopement. So it was, but just to say, like, they will start him in there, like, so if that's what you want, and see if that's the right setting, because we also felt that it would be. But then he got there and it was 22 other kindergartners who never been to school, never left home either, and it was just too overwhelming for him. So now he's in a class of only 4 kids. But in the beginning, he was able to like still go to specials like art and music and stuff like that, and they kind of integrate into general education. And like my oldest, he used to go to like, he was in life skills, but sometimes he would go for the beginning of the math lesson or the beginning of the reading lesson, and then they would take his work and go back to the classroom. So they had a smaller special education setting for the work, but he could still be included with the
and that's the great part about the IEP individualized is every student's going to have a different IEP plan. It's actually illegal for them to create the IEP and the accommodations before you've had that meeting. They have to finalize it in that meeting. So like you can't show up and they're like, oh, we have this cookie cutter IEP for you. It has to be specific to your child. So there's lots of different ways they can go around that. Go ahead.
Two-part question. One, I had an ARD meeting, like an initial ARD meeting. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was a Zoom meeting, and it was like, showing me the screen, kind of rushed through it. And my husband and I were both on it, and they're like, do you have any other questions? And we're like, no. And then we like, sign here. And so I'm like, gosh, I really wish that was in person.
You can request it.
Yeah.
Every single time.
Yeah, so during During COVID, they definitely, I mean, obviously because nobody was in person, they shifted to online, and a lot of places are still trying to do online. But you 100%, yeah, you can request in person.
I don't know. I just feel like I would get a more comfortable and more thorough,
Yeah.
setting.
And I do want to make a note as well that you never have to sign an IEP at the end of the meeting. So if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't understand anything, you just say, you know what, I don't feel comfortable right now. I didn't understand this fully. I'm going to go home. I'm going to think on it. Can you please share the draft with me? And I'll get back to you. Or you can ask for a delay and you can reschedule in 15, 30 days. I would like to delay this IEP. But if you're unfamiliar with something, then 100% do not sign that IEP. It's, again, a legally binding contract. So once you sign it, you're saying, I agree to my child receiving these services. And their job in the IEP meeting is to make you understand what they're trying to tell you. So if you don't understand it and they're not making you understand it, be like, you didn't do a great enough job.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to sign this.
Two things.
Wait, sorry, hold on. I think she had a second part to the question.
I'm so sorry, real quick. So let's say, I go through the IEP and I'm like, gosh, there are some changes I want to make. Is there a way to ask for another art? Do you have to go through an art meeting to make those IEP changes?
So you always have to go through an ARD meeting to make an IEP change, but you can request an ARD meeting at any time during the school year. So you can always request it, or if you're in that meeting and like you said, you don't feel comfortable with some of the changes or you want more, either say in that meeting, I want these changes, or you can say, because sometimes they'll try to rush you, they'll be like, we have a meeting after this. Okay, I'm not going to sign for right now. I'll send you a follow-up email with some of the things that I'm thinking of. I would also like to request another ARD meeting or a follow-up ARD meeting. So yeah, if you ever feel uncomfortable or if you want to make a change, don't sign the document. Because once you sign it, you're saying, I agree with this. And it's always harder to change it in retrospect than it is to just be like, I need some time and push it off for a bit.
Yeah, along those lines, I'm literally going through that with my 5-year-old where they verbally agreed to something in the meeting and it was in the present levels, but they didn't add the accommodation to back up what he needed. And now I'm having to go back and fight the school to make sure it's in the IEP. And we were talking about always do everything written, save literally everything. I have emails from 3 years ago because it's data that you're collecting over time to show the need for your child. So any email you send to a teacher, any email, I have 3 with IEPs, anything that you send to the school, keep it, even if it's 2 or 3 years later, because it shows the consistent need that can help you get the accommodation that your kid needs.
And just a tip and trick for that, I use Google for everything for my emails. You can always create a little folder and just title it IEP, and then I dump everything related to it because it makes it easier. Because if y'all are like me, you've had the same Google email address for 30 years now, so it's you've got stuff in Hot Topic from God knows how long. So I was a little emo in high school, so I always have little folders that are IEP, anything important. I just make little folders, immediately shuffle them in there, even if I'm not sure if it's important. If it has to do with Stella, throw it in there. I have medical and IEP, so any doctor stuff has its own folder, and then anything school related has its own folder. That's just me. I like little boxes to put things in. All right, any other questions before I move forward? I feel like we're gonna answer all the questions before I even get there on the slides, which is perfect. So who's actually at the IEP table with you when you sit down, or the Zoom call? You, obviously. I 100% recommend that you go to an ARD meeting. They will tell you that you don't have to be there, especially if it's just an annual. They'll be like, oh, if you like the IEP, we can sign for you. You don't have to attend. If you don't attend, you are giving up the agency that occurs when you're there. Because sometimes you might not be 100% well-read in what that IEP says. So I always just recommend, as much as possible, attend those meetings. They have to schedule it so it fits your schedule. If they try to say you need to be here at this day and you can't make it because you have work, be like, oh, bummer, reschedule it. That's on you to fit my schedule. Obviously it has to occur within school hours. Don't say a Sunday at 3, but they need to make sure that you're able to be there. So don't feel pressured to kind of waive those rights and just have them sign for you. I always recommend making sure that you can be there. So you or parent or guardian, general education teacher, there should be at least 1 to 2. Sometimes it's 1 and a counselor. They kind of mix and match. But most of the time the gen ed teachers will just provide the information virtually through like a form. And that's where a lot of that data comes from if your student's in a gen ed classroom. Then you have the special education teacher. They ensure that the goals are realistic and the supports are appropriate for your child because they know your child best, especially if you're in a program like Life Skills or RISE. They're gonna be the ones who are working with your child more, so they have that insight. A school psychologist or diagnostician, especially in the triannuals, they're usually there just to help give that information, but they can also provide the information virtually and kind of send in that information over email. And then an administrator who approves services and ensures compliance with laws. I, having been in education for 10 plus years, administrators have a lot on their plate. And one of the things that they might not necessarily always be actively doing is following up on the legalities that happen with SPED. They tend to be really focused on budget, on the day-to-day, what's going to be more difficult for their teachers. So just because an administrator says something like, oh, we can't provide this service for your child, doesn't mean it's necessarily true. You're gonna have great administrators in every school, and you're gonna come across some that don't really know what they're doing, but they have that badge of administrator. So as a parent, we tend to feel like, this isn't my space, so I don't wanna challenge. If you don't feel comfortable, if they say we can't provide this for your child, I'm not gonna sign this. I'm gonna wait and look into it myself, and then we'll come back and we'll reschedule a meeting, because you just wanna make sure that you've done your due diligence.
Is that a good time to maybe look into getting someone like an advocate like you into it?
Yes.
Okay.
So I always recommend, especially if you've had difficulties with the school ahead of time, that you bring an advocate in there. Sometimes even just telling the school, if you do have an advocate, I recommend you tell them 1 to 2 weeks ahead of the meeting. Hi, I just wanted to let you know I'm bringing an advocate. Being on the teacher side, I know the fear that strikes. They're like, oh, she's bringing an advocate, like she's serious. Even if you're just like, I'm just here to chill and be emotional support. Knowing that there's a second set of eyes on you makes you, as the IEP review team, a lot more conscious, and also makes them prepare on the back end a little bit more. If an administrator knows an advocate's gonna be in a meeting, they will do more of that background information, more of that legality, because there's a little bit of fear that comes with it. And I like to show up and be a little scary.
You can help too, like when you're getting all the IEPs and the emails and stuff, you can help like the parent who's overwhelmed, like that would be me, like crying, looking at all of it, being like, I got this. Like,
Yeah.
right? So once you hire an advocate like yourself, like you can help read over and then like consolidate and give like the meaty information to the parent. So,
Yeah.
okay.
So like what I would do if I was in that situation, if I had a parent that I was working with, let's say Jamie, she's getting ready to transition Frankie into school, Frankie's her son, and she's like, Megan, I really want you to come work with me. If she already had an IEP on file or something, she could send me that IEP. As an advocate, that's what I usually ask for. Can you send me any current IEPs, any current evaluations? I look through it, I mark it up, I say, what are your goals for your child? What are you wanting? What are changes do you want to happen? And then I'm able to kind of compartmentalize that. Like I said, I love little boxes. So you just give me the info dump, I clean it for you, and then I show up and I say, oh, this is actually what she wanted. Because if you're like every other parent, when you're sitting there with 6 adults in a room staring at you, telling you, like, and you feel like, again, this isn't my space, it doesn't mean that you're not educated, it doesn't mean that you're not smart, it doesn't mean any of these things. This is not your space. So having that advocate there really is just that extra support system. We organize, we kind of provide the confidence for you. Even if it's just like a little slap on the knee, like, tell them to shut up. Like that's the support that we provide.
It's like having a realtor to look over your contract for your home, right?
Yeah.
That you're about to purchase.
I don't know about y'all, but like anytime I go buy a car, I bring my dad. I'm 35 years old, I bring my dad to buy a car.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I need someone there who's got the know-how. My mom has been in special education for 30 years. She trained special education teachers for Pleasanton ISD in California. And when I go to meetings for my daughter, I bring her. Because I'm confident and I know what I'm talking about. And I still am like, I need that secondary person, just because we get heated when it's about our kids. Like, and I think sometimes we get overwhelmed, we shut down, the anxiety knowing you have that meeting, like that you go in and you're just like, all of a sudden you lose everything. And so like, I bring my mom, and then if I get flustered, my mom's like, wait a minute. Yes.
How far in advance can you request the IEP for the meeting so you can review it? Because I've been, like, my first IEP meeting or my first ARD meeting, I was given it the day of, and I was like, or the day before, and you know, if it's an evaluation, it's 20 plus pages of like jargon that you're not familiar with. So how far in advance is reasonable?
So that's a kind of a tricky question because there's a lot of moving pieces.
Right.
So any educational data, you have a right under FERPA to have access to that at any time. The IEP itself though, because they cannot pre-create the IEP before the IEP meeting, you can't get some of the things like accommodations beforehand. So you can always request a draft, but that's really gonna have the information from the teachers, it's gonna have data. And so I would recommend requesting that like a week in advance, just because a lot of the time the teachers have 8 million things going on. So you'll be able to get any educational data for your child in advance, but the actual IEP, you can't get it because then that would also be breaking the law by saying that they had a cookie cutter IEP already in place for your child. So I always recommend keeping those old IEPs, using those, and then as an English teacher, I like to annotate. I mark those things up, and then I put those changes, like I bring that annotated IEP with me. Does that help? Okay, yeah.
And you should be able to request data like at the drop of a hat. And
Yes.
They should have it to you like within.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the timeline, but it should be quick. So yeah, you can, by FERPA laws, you have access to any data, diagnostics, anything that occurs with your child in school, you have access to that at any time, except for the portions of the IEP that they have to agree on and write in the IEP meeting. So you can always ask for a draft. It just might not be beautiful and conclusive, but you can always ask for it. I say a week or so in advance.
I was just gonna say, cause I'm in the middle of getting like 3 evaluations done right now. A week is fine, but make sure you give them plenty of time before that because everybody's shuffling. Like let them know a couple weeks in advance. I'd like it a week in advance, you know what I mean?
Just me.
Step back.
Just so they know.
Just talking.
Our yoga teacher.
That's because I have a cold right now, and so I don't know about y'all, but like I get stuffy and a little bit sweaty.
Could you clarify the definition under federal law, education versus academics for people? Because I think that the schools tend to focus on academics versus educational need, which includes a lot more than just what the grades are.
So like literally anything that has to do with your child, anything that has been published, written, even like referrals, you legally have access to every single thing that has ever been written about your child in education. I don't know if they still have the big like file folders like they did when I started teaching it 10 years ago, but we literally, for the students, I mean, they have that Q file that follows them. You have access to that at any time. So it doesn't, if they're like, oh yeah, we can give you their grades, or a lot of the time they'll say, well, you can check the grades online. No, I don't want the grades. I want everything. Give it all to me. And they have to legally give that to
Well,
you.
and even in the IEP meeting, they'll focus on the academic side, not necessarily the behavioral, educational. Educational is like emotional and behavioral, like anything they evaluate for. And from my kids have IEPs, but they're in Gen Ed, and they tend to focus on, but their grades are great, but I'm like, but they're suffering for those grades.
Even like something like a behavior tracking that a teacher does, like maybe they have like a little check mark box that they do. You have access to that. You can request those files.
And then as a parent, keeping track of how does your child talk about school? How are they after school? And then like I had to have an occupational therapist write a letter that said she collected data about behavior and even how it's affecting his occupational therapy from summer versus in school.
Yeah.
And just knowing that like your kid has rights above academics, they are not grades. It's everything, even into transition and how they're going to be independent.
Yes.
Long term.
It's literally anything that's documented about your child in any way, shape, or form. You have access to that. You have rights to see that. If they try to make it difficult, you just say legally under FERPA, you're required to legally give me this information. If they say, well, it's going to do this, that's not my problem. It's on you. The burden of proof is on you. You need to provide those documents to me. So I always want to make sure that when I work with parents, they feel empowered to just straight up be like, that's not my problem. Like, that's my favorite saying. That's your problem, not my problem. I'm asking for this. You need to figure out how you're going to give it to me. Yeah, because it is. A lot of the time, they'll be like, oh, that's going to be really difficult for us. Okay. Like, what a bummer. Figure it out. And they, I mean, it is like, you always want to collaborate, right? Because everyone in that room should be working towards the best interest of the student. But there are cases, there are situations where you do have to be the firm one and just be like, I'm sorry that that's difficult for you in the school. Legally, my child has these rights. It is what it is. Figure out how you're going to do it on your end, because this is what my child deserves. And that's it. Like, you have the right to ask for that. You have the right to push for that. I think I saw a half hand.
Like a stretching.
Oh, okay. I was like, I saw one.
Getting ready for yoga.
I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next slide. Sections of an IEP, so that giant document that you look at right in that moment, they're like, here's 20 pages. It really breaks down into 4 sections. The PLAF, which I don't know why in Texas they call it the PLAF, but that is present levels and academic functions. So that's the big first section of your IEP. That talks about where your student is at currently. So describes what your child can currently do, and that is based on stakeholder data. So that is where they, academic wise, that's where they get like teacher input, if they have OTs, if they have speech, if they're receiving any services, that all gets accumulated and put into the PLAF, which is just really, here's what, my daughter's name is Stella, here's what Stella can do currently based on what we've evaluated her at. Next you have goals. Goals are where we get, for me, this is the sticky part, because we're all very familiar with accommodations, right? But goals are really important because that's what's driving your student's education. They do not have to be purely academic goals. You can have goals that are social skills based. You can have goals that are like emotional well-being based. Predominantly schools do focus on academic goals just because that is the most easily trackable, and I mean, it's a school. That's really what they're focusing on. But you always want your goals to be specific. So SMART goals, if any of y'all have heard of it, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and I always add realistic, and time bound. So this is something that I do again with parents that I work with when I go through their IEPs, is I look at their goals. Sometimes you get these goals that are wild. They'll be like, my student will make 3 friends.
Yeah.
What? Like, that is not measurable. That is not potentially achievable, but it's also not necessarily realistic, and it's not quantifiable. So if you have no real way to measure these goals, how can we determine if they're working or not? Goals have to be determined based on data. So if the goals are not measurable, then they can't be data supported. There's no way to figure out where the gap in learning is happening if there's no quantifiable evidence, if there's no measurable evidence. You also want them to be specific and time bound. So by the end of this school year, by the end of the semester, just because you want to know when you've hit that goal. Open-ended goals don't really serve anyone, because it's easy to then just be like, we'll keep that goal for the next one because it seems like they're still working on it. Why are they still working on it? You know, it doesn't mean necessarily that there's something wrong with your child because they're still working on it. Sometimes our kids take longer to hit those goals, but if it's really vague, again, why have they not hit it then yet? Is it because we don't have data to show where they're missing? It's not. So we need all of those little components to be able to measure it and have it be a strong goal. Otherwise, we're really floundering. If you ask, why did they not hit this goal? And it's just kind of like, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You should have data to show where we're missing. Where's that gap in learning occurring? So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound SMART goals. Any questions on that really quick before we move into the next part? Okay, cool. Accommodations and services. Accommodations are going to be things like visual schedules, extended time, sensory breaks, occupational therapy, speech therapy, those are services. Behavioral support. So again, those goals do not just have to be in English, my child will do this. It can be academic, it can be emotional, it can be social. There's a lot of different aspects to those. And then for services, a lot of people don't know, but if you have an IEP on file, and there is services recommended in that IEP. So speech, OT, if there's minutes that are required, the school district has to provide you with those. And if they say we can't, they say we don't have an OT, again, legally, that's not my problem. They have to pay for your child to get those services. So whether they do that through vouchers, whether they do that through like a reimbursement, it can differ based on where you're at or how they want to work on it with you. The school is legally obligated to give you those services. If it's in the IEP, it's a legally binding contract. It doesn't matter if they don't have someone on site or on district that can do that. Find somebody, outsource it for me, because that's legally my child's right to that.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're good.
You brought up OT, and that has been my pain point up until. So we moved from New York 3 years ago, and I had an advocate.
I hear the accent, the New York accent. My family's all from Brooklyn, so.
I feel like I didn't really have to tell you that.
Great services there.
We had
Sorry.
great services, right?
Yeah.
And I had an advocate who was like known in the whole state, and like she got anything for any child, like you name it. My son had a great IEP when we moved. It got shredded when it came here. Like things were just burned out. Obviously, I didn't know, like, don't sign the IEP, we don't agree with it. I signed. Unfortunately, ever since I've signed, I've been trying to get him things back, and it has been like impossible. Sorry to give you the whole backstory.
No, you're good.
But specifically with OT, it's been the most impossible thing to get back. When we moved over here, my son had OT like 4 days a week for like 45 minutes, right? And the OT back in New York would focus on sensory, motor, like you name it, she was doing it, like dry brushing, like
Oh my god, I love a good dry brush.
Who doesn't?
My husband says I'm a horse. I just
I know. Yes.
But and so, you know, all that stuff is gone now. And every time I come to an IEP meeting and, you know, I wanna talk about OT and I wanna I always bring in like sensory things like headphones, like I'll bring all these things up. I always get the reply of like, that's not what we focus on here. Like we're strictly here for academic, and because your son can hold a pen, and because your son can like, you know, put a button on the right place, he doesn't qualify for any more. That is like a real struggle for me, because I think there's so much more that he needs from like an OT perspective.
Regulation.
Yeah.
That just doesn't maybe necessarily fall into him holding the pen. Like yes, he can hold the pencil, but he needs more sensory breaks. You know, like things like that.
Girl, it was like you were speaking through my body. Like, literally, I was raising my hand and you started talking, and I was like, yes, this is literally what I was going to say. Like, they're like, can he draw a line down the page? I'm like, I don't know. He needs like bounces. He needs like pressure. He needs like just to be functional.
OT.
No, and insurance, like out here, for us, we've been like fighting tooth and nail to be like, because if she puts anything sensory in like the codes, they're like, we don't cover that. And that's like, you're a Blue Cross Blue Shield, are you kidding me?
So one way that you can get around that is you can actually request, especially if you have a good primary care physician, anything that they diagnose or they prescribe. So doctors can literally prescribe anything. They can prescribe that they need sensory integration. I love my PCP because she knows nothing about autism, but she trusts me. So I say, my daughter needs OT. And she goes, oh, okay, let me just write a prescription for her. And she writes that prescription for her. Now it is prescribed by a doctor, and the doctor is the one that's gonna be holding that responsibility. The insurance is gonna listen to them because the doctor in their office is the one that's gonna go to bat for you when it comes to that. If it's a diagnosis and you bring that into the school, you say my child has to have this, it's gonna add so much legitimacy to what you're asking for. And if they continue to push back, honestly, when it gets to that, I never want it to seem like I'm like selling myself, but when you have a school that's really fighting you and you feel like you don't have anywhere to go from that, you have to bring in a second person. So I always recommend in that situation, you're like, I've tried everything and they keep pushing back. If you feel like you're not getting anywhere, tell them, I'm gonna bring an advocate to the next meeting and these are the concerns that I wanna have. Even if you don't wanna actually bring one, tell them, I'm gonna bring an advocate to the next meeting, these are the concerns I'm bringing up. And then I always like to say, do you have data to support that decision? Because they might be like, well, he drew a line. You're gonna say, but where's the data that's provided that's like, because you're saying that he does not need sensory integration. You're saying that he does not need regulatory support.
Why is he laying on the floor?
Right.
Literally, right?
Well, Frank
Where
can't
is
sit
the
in the chair.
data?
He's laying on the floor a lot. No shit.
Yeah. And if that's the issue, right? You say, so
What
where is your
district are you
data?
We're CISD.
Yeah.
I've been fighting that fight for the last
heard
8 years.
Conroe is
I've heard Conroe is a wild, wild
It's
west.
hard.
Honestly, I'm in Sci-Fair. Sci-Fair is the wild, wild west. Like, we live in the wild, wild
See,
west.
so my mom was a SLP in schools, and my best friend is a SLP in HISD. And it's terrible that, you know, we kind of look at it this way, but I look at any time like when Tag was in ECSC and he got speech and OT there, that's great, but we still have our own that we go to outside of it. Like, and I know my best friend, she's an SLP, and like they have groups, you know what I mean? So like she sees these kids for, you know, once or twice a week for however many minutes, but there's a group of like 3 kids, you know? So like if you're using that as your sole like provider, I would be weary in terms of like the actual results you're gonna get. So that would be something, you know, too, like you want them to have that at school and you want them to have what they need, but in terms of like getting the real results from it, I would still have the person that you take them to outside of school.
I love that, and I'm so glad that you brought that up.
Yeah.
Like, my kid goes to therapy Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So, like, on our own. You know what I mean? And this
So
is
we have to pay
interesting.
for more, have to
We
pay
couldn't
for
even
more.
get through our ARD or IEP. We went in, and my son is 3, and we went right before he turned 3, because you have to get it done, like, before they're 3. And I was like, oh, maybe we'll go gen ed. We've had him in a private little thing, and he's happy there. But we went in, and it was my son and my husband and I, and initially the director, and she was great. Like, she was really great. And then she took us into a room with 3 other adults that he does not know. One being the SLP, one being the
Diagnostician.
yeah, and then one being their head of OT or what, you know. And so we walk in, we're in a strange place. There's now 4 adults in the room that he doesn't know, and they're all just like coming at him with things. And it's like, my kid proceeds to have a total fucking meltdown. We couldn't even get through, like, we were doing like walks around the school to like try to like, but like people were like following us and like asking him, he's 3 and he's not nonverbal, but we're not conversational at all. Like,
Yeah.
we're just trying to like find our words again. And so we couldn't even get through it. We were there for over an hour. And I'm like, I don't fuck around, you guys. Like, I am like, this is not happening. Like, I'm not the mom that's just like, I'm not gonna sit there and just be like, okay, like, let them do their process or like whatever it is. I did that, and we tried to like split stuff up, and I'm saying like, hey y'all, I don't know if this is how you normally approach things, but this is not working for us, so we're leaving. And they're like, well, we can reschedule, like, when is a better time? I'm like, if this is how y'all are gonna do it, there's never a better time for this. And I'm embarrassed for you guys, because if this is your job, they're at the top of the food chain, basically, when it comes to like doing the evaluation, right? And they're like attacking like a 3-year-old.
And
What'd
so
you do
this is
there?
a perfect time that you document that information. Because if they're not gonna do it, you do it, right? You get in the car, you pull up your notes app, you say, this meeting went on for this long, Frankie had X amount of meltdowns, Frankie needed this many sensory integrations. You send it in an email immediately to the school.
Okay.
Say, hi, I just wanted to recap on our meeting. Unfortunately, I know it didn't go as well. These are the notes that I took. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, or if you differ in opinion about this. And then when they send back and they go, thank you, you go, oh, they agreed, right? They might not have agreed necessarily, but you got it in writing. They didn't counter anything. You print that email out, you bring it to the next meeting. When they say your child doesn't need sensory integration, you say, well, I told you, I documented all these things that happened. You were there, you witnessed, you emailed me back, and you acknowledged that that occurred. So what part of that, where's your data? Because I brought my data. So you always want to show up with data, documentation.
No, I mean, I'm just gonna like straight up hire you, and you know I'm going to, because I'm just like, listen, like, I don't have a hard time advocating for him, but I do have a hard time being like getting into my car. He's still having a meltdown in the back seat because this has been going on for an hour, and like I can't even like center my thoughts. All I can think is like, our sitter needs to leave that's watching the 1.5-year-old. We have to get home. Frankie's gonna have like, you guys know when they have a meltdown, like how the rest of the day is gonna go, or maybe even like a week or 2 afterwards. It's terrible.
Yeah.
We are gonna hire you. Like, that's not.
We can
also
don't ask for everything to be recorded,
It's
right? You
tomball
might say that,
IEPs.
so like, that's what my best friend did.
It's a little bit iffy in
Much
the
different
classroom.
experience, thank goodness. It was at Black Elementary. I don't know, it's in Psych Fair.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
Oh, yeah, I know where that is.
We live right by Coles Crossing. My mom lives in Coles Crossing.
We're in Longwood, so we're like right area.
So it's
Yeah.
in Linwood, the apartment right
Some
there.
people don't understand
Well,
it.
I had one.
I can't talk to India.
There was a bunch of people, but only one was with her. Two were talking to me, and it went so different. That makes me so sad that they did that because she was
It's
3,
horrible. It's horrible.
and it was a complete opposite.
Yeah, and Katie.
And they're keeping it for her. They let me know, hey, you don't have to go because it was gonna have to be half days, and that's way too hard for kids like that. You know,
Yeah, it's like
to
what?
move schools in the
Yeah,
2 different schools one day. You know,
yeah, it's gonna be 3 hours.
it was the
What-
exact opposite.
What am I gonna do?
So
Yeah.
it's not supposed to be
It
like
was
that.
it was awful, and like I really wish Megan and I are close, so I could have called her about this, but like I was like, I just sent them an email like the next day basically, and I was like, yeah, like at this time like we're not ready to continue with this, like but please keep our information on file.
Because Jamie only calls me at 11 o'clock at night. We only talk at midnight when we're
Or
having
or
mental
if I'm like in a
breakdowns.
totally manic episode at 11 o'clock in the morning, I'm like,
Yeah.
Megan, are you available? This is what just happened.
All right, y'all. Loving the questions and discussions, but I do want to keep moving us forward. So I'm gonna keep going, and then we can jump back in. We do have time slotted for a Q&A at the end. So quick questions, feel free to jump in. But I am gonna try and move us forward. So all right, the last section of your IEP is placement. So where the services will be provided. We kind of touched on this earlier. Least restrictive environment is where they're legally required to place your child, but that might not be the best for your child. So in that placement section, that's where they're gonna say, oh, they're gonna have a life skills program, they're gonna have a RISE program, they're gonna be mainstreamed or in gen ed for English and math, but science and social studies, they're gonna be placed into a supplementary program, things like that. So the last section of the IEP is where those services are gonna be taking place. It's really important that you know where those services are taking place, because you might be thinking that your child is in one room and in reality they're in a completely different room. So, and not like physically, but like if I think my child is mainstreamed, is in a gen ed classroom, and I find out that they are actually not, that could not be working for my goals, my child's goals, etc. So you always want to make sure, where are these services taking place? Sometimes you don't want your child in a gen ed classroom, especially high school. 35 plus kids in a classroom, maybe that's not the space for your child. But if they're saying, well, that's the least restrictive environment, again, you kind of always want to ask, where's your data to make these decisions? Either across the board, I want them in a more restrictive, I want them in a less restrictive. If they're making a decision and you don't agree with it, ask them, where is the data supporting this argument? Where is the data supporting this decision? Legally, they have to have it. A lot of the time, and I'm a teacher, so sometimes I feel like I'm like going against myself, but a lot of the time, teachers do not have documentation for this information because we are slammed. That is not your problem. That is on them, and you know what? If the teacher doesn't have time to do that, then administration, to follow legalities and keep themselves out of trouble, they need to find a time, or they need to work with their staff to figure out how that's gonna work. It is not on you. If a teacher says, this kid's not performing in my class, I can't deal with this kid in my class anymore, they need to be in a special education classroom. Where's your data? You can't just say, oh, the kid's failing. Where's your data? What have you tried? What are the accommodations that you've put in place in the classroom? Where's the documentation for those accommodations? And again, as a teacher, we don't have a lot of that because we don't have time. And I'm not telling you to leverage that, but leverage it. If it's not benefiting your child and they don't have that data, push. That's your space to kind of push. And honestly, they should be documenting it. It sucks, they don't have time to do it, but it's your child and they should be doing it. And that's the most important part. So always ask, where's your data for this decision? I'm gonna say 75% of the time they're not gonna have that data. That gives you leg room to really be like, oh, perfect, here's my data. Here's what I want, and if you don't have data, then I'm gonna push this IEP meeting off until you do have data to support that decision and kind of move forward from there. All right. So next section, common challenges. We kind of touched on this a lot, but overcoming common IEP hurdles. The biggest one is disagreement on services. So like I said, we've been talking about this for quite some time, but disagreements on services, when this happens, they say, your kid doesn't need this, you say my kid does need this. Focus on data and documented needs. Bring your own data if you like. I always also, on top of my little email folders, I have just, it's not cute, it's just a box, honestly, it's shoved in my closet. Anytime I get paperwork from Stella, I throw it in the box. Bring the box, like who cares? Just bring the box. So bring your own data if you would like. I always recommend it. Don't forget that just because you would like an accommodation though, it doesn't necessarily mean that the school will determine it necessary. I will always fight for you to get what you think your kid needs, but sometimes this is where an advocate is kind of helpful to step outside and be like, I know you want a one-on-one aid for your kid, but that's actually gonna hinder them. So sometimes we do kind of provide that outside perspective. Just because you're convinced my child needs a one-on-one aid, they might not actually need a one-on-one aid. And so sometimes you do have to work with the school in that sense, because again, even though we have a lot of things that can be negatively said about our school districts, the teachers are truly doing their best, most of them, to help your child. So we really want to kind of work together with them. It's not going to help if we're stepping in as adversaries. We want to work together. So listen to what they have to say. Just because you're like 100% my kids need this doesn't mean that they will get it. And sometimes you need to kind of like sit back and be like, why? Why is my kid not getting this? If the data is proving your kid doesn't need that, then maybe your kid really doesn't need that. And so that's kind of where you can bounce ideas off of an advocate, because we do sometimes get kind of pigeonholed into what our idea of what our kids' education should look like. So I always recommend that's kind of a helpful place. That's one of those kind of things too, where you can just shoot me a message on Instagram. I think me and Shayla have talked about that. She shot me a message. She was like, what do you think about this? And I was like, oh yeah, well you could try this, this, and this. So sometimes that's like a short form. Just send me a message, bounce an idea off of me. Do you think my kid needs a one-on-one aid if they're doing this? And I'll be like, maybe, let's talk about it. So just remember that just because you want an accommodation doesn't 100% mean you're guaranteed to get it. One of the other common challenges, again, we talked about this, lack of clear goals. So you always want to make sure you're pushing for SMART goals. If you are confused on how that goal is going to get achieved, then that is not going to be a measurable and quantifiable goal. So when you're reading those goals and they're saying that this is what we want your kid to do, try and ask yourself, how are you going to tell if they did that? Because if they're just like, again, child will engage with friend 3 times by the end of the year. How are you going to measure that? What does that look like? What does the engagement look like? Who's going to be documenting this? How many controlled environments and how many controlled times are you going to give them? So you always want to have the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. And then limited communication. This goes back to what I think you were saying, like you asked them, I think it was Myra that said it, she sent an email or called and nobody responded back to you. If you have limited communication and you're not getting regular communication or you feel you're not being heard, you have the right to request consistent updates. I would like a monthly check-in. It could be something like progress reports. Because everything's digital now, the school will tend to try and push you off into searching it up by yourself. You can look at their grades online. I don't want to just look at their grades. I want to know how many homework assignments are they missing? What are their test scores? So it's going to be different based on what like back-end LMS looks like in each school, what you can see. But you can request consistent updates from the school. I want to talk to somebody. I want an email from their teacher once a month. You can always request these things. You're not guaranteed to get them because sometimes our requests can be a little bit much. But you can always request more consistent updates and consistent communication. Don't be afraid to speak up. Everyone in the room should be working towards your child's best interest. I like to tell myself, what's the worst thing that can happen? They're gonna say no. They weren't gonna give it to my child if I didn't ask anyways. So I always ask. I would rather ask for more and receive less than receive less and never have asked for more. Because you just never know. Sometimes they'll be like, oh yeah, we can email you once a month and we can give you an update. And you're like, whew, I cried about this for 3 days thinking that they were gonna think I was difficult, and they did not bat an eye on it. So always ask. And my actionable tip, I've said it 40 times already, use phrases like, can you show me data supporting that decision? That's my go-to. I'm tattoo that one next. Can you show me data supporting that decision? Data. All right, so preparing for ARD meetings, being ready to advocate effectively. Gather recent evaluations, report cards, and work samples. Bring the box, right? Just throw everything in the box, bring the box. Write down specific concerns or questions. I always recommend annotating the IEP. It's the English teacher in me. Take the last IEP, annotate it, use that space to write your questions down. Even if the question is, I don't understand what this means. Legally, that is their responsibility to educate you on what it means. it is really easy to want to not feel like you don't know what they're saying. So you might get uncomfortable, you might be like, oh, everyone else in the room knows what that means except for me. Like, oh, who cares? Ask for it. Say, write on the IEP, what does this mean? Can you put this in layman's terms? Can you explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old, right? Michael Scott, explain this to me like I'm a 3-year-old. So, it is legally their responsibility to make sure you fully understand the IEP, mark up that IEP, bring it in, and just kind of go through it page by page. These are the things I have questions on. And that also helps you review the current IEP and note areas needing updating. So again, if goals, maybe you just transitioned from middle school to high school. The goals are no longer applicable. Maybe you did not have somebody who wrote great transition goals in middle school. Now, freshman year's over, the goals were not working. This is a great time to say, hey, these were the goals. We didn't love them. They weren't actionable. They weren't measurable. We want to be able to update them. So bring the current IEP and note areas needing updates, and bring a support person or advocate if needed. If you don't want to bring an advocate, bring your mom, bring your friend, bring your neighbor, bring somebody just to sit next to you and kind of level you out. I always recommend that, and because you can do it virtually, be like, hey, can I Zoom call you in? Set the phone up next to you, be like, this is Greg, my neighbor, he's gonna be partaking in this with us. Just bring somebody to support you if you need to. Greg's always the name of my student, my bad student, because I've never had a student named Greg in 10 years. All right, and then after the meeting, Jamie, you've made a good point that a lot of the time you're really stressed in the car, especially if you have a kid with you. For me, I try to follow up with an email detailing pertinent information as soon as possible. If you have kids in the car and they're screaming and you're like, I don't have time right now to write this long detailed email, do a quick voice note on your phone where you just word vomit all of your thoughts, all of your ideas, all of the questions that appeared after you left the stress of the meeting. By the time you get to the car, you always have 10 more questions that popped up, 10 more things where you're like, I should have said this. Just voice note to yourself. And then when you get home, you have a little bit less stressful environment after the kids go to bed. Send a follow-up email where you summarize what you saw in the meeting, even if it feels redundant, and then say thank you. Thank you so much for meeting with me today. I truly appreciated your time. These are the things that I really appreciated. These are the things I was concerned about. Thank you, blah, blah, blah. And then again, it's just a written detail. Even if it's just a summary, you just summarized it. You have that written information. You went over, these were the issues that I had concerns with, and you put it in writing. Because no one's sitting at that meeting typing, saying, Megan was concerned about this IEP goal. I'm the only one that's gonna do that. So next year, or next art evaluation, when they're like, the goal is fine, you say, I had concerns about it the last meeting. I emailed you about it. You said to stick it out. Here we are a year later. I still have concerns about it. And here's the email where I told you I had concerns. So document, document, document. Document everything, even if it's ugly, even if it's unprofessional, even if it's spelled incorrectly, document it because you need it in writing. And then set calendar reminders for follow-ups or progress checks. So if you're asking for more consistent communication from the school, you need to make sure you are also providing that communication. You need to make sure you are also, I think the sickness is starting to flare back up, y'all.
Get some air.
Let me get some air real quick.
Yeah.
Hey, mate, you've got like 5 more minutes.
I know, I'm just gonna die on the floor real quick. So set calendar reminders for follow-ups or progress checks. So if you want consistent communication, you have to also be consistently communicating. You can't go off the grid for 6 months and then all of a sudden be like, well, you guys haven't talked to me. Like, yes, they should have been talking to you, but also, if you really want that communication, you want it to be constant, take the lead on it because they have God knows how many kids. You have 1 to 7, right? I don't know how many kids you guys have, but so always make sure that you are giving as much as you're expecting to get. That was my last slide.
Yay,
so Q&A session.
Can I, I know some moms need to leave early and they wanted to do gentle yoga.
Okay.
So I think this would be a great time to get that started. Think about your questions, things that you want to ask Megan. And then after we wrap up gentle yoga,
Yeah.